All right, welcome everyone. Glad to have you joining us either for the first time or for multiple times. As you know, this is the product stack, and we've been doing a series of webinars recently focused on product operations. This is our second session in a series of three. Today we're being joined by three pivots, three experts from Pivotal, who are going to be discussing the processes they put in place around product operations as their team scaled from just a few to over 80. So we're excited to have them today and looking forward to a great conversation. As a brief reminder first of who the product stack is, we're a group of like-minded organizations seeking to offer practical solutions for modern product teams. So we encourage you to join our community. You can visit that URL that's on the site there, theproductstack.com. From there, you'll get a link to join our Slack channel, where all the panelists are members. I'm a member, and I think we have over 2,000 product folk from around the country and world. Happy to have conversations either about this topic or any topic that you may have. Also on our website, theproductstack.com, you can see all of our past webinars, including the first session that we had on product operations just a couple weeks ago. So I'm Kevin Steigerwald. I'm the VP of Products and UX here at JAMA Software. I'm one of the original founders of the product stack, so very excited to be moderating today. Like I said, we have a great panel of experts from Pivotal, and I'm going to have them introduce themselves, starting with you, Ariel.
Hi, I'm Ariel Silverman. I'm one of the directors of product management here at Pivotal. Been here about 5.5 years. Very excited to talk about this topic today.
Great, Tom.
Cool. My name is Tom Lee. I'm a director of technical program management working with Pivotal inside Cloud R&D. I feel super lucky to be at Pivotal and working with great other program managers as well as product managers and pivots. And really am excited helping them focus on how to make our organization better than the sum of its parts and focusing on feedback loops.
Great. Amber.
I'm Amber Alston. I've been with Pivotal for about 4 years. I work out of our Denver office. I've been a product manager for over a decade at this point, working in a series of companies, small and large. And one of the reasons I'm excited about this topic is watching Pivotal's rapid growth over the 4 years I've been there has really hammered home how important these practices are, how quickly the challenges can present themselves, and how important it is to keep an eye on it.
Great, awesome. Well, again, thank the three of you for being here. Looking forward to a great conversation. Just a couple other housekeeping notes before we get started for our audience. This is being recorded. It will be shared out after the webinar, and we will eventually then post it to our site as well. So you can always come back and share it then with your colleagues. If this is your first time using GoToWebinar, there is the ability through the side panel that you should see to ask questions. So we do have a couple team members behind the scenes here who will be fielding those questions. We do have a live Q&A at the end of this panel. So at any point, if you have a specific question that maybe we don't dig into enough during the conversation, feel free to add it, and we'll do our best to address it at the end. And then, like I said, about our Slack community, please feel free to join our Slack community at theproductstack.com. We're more than happy to continue this conversation or any conversations about product from there as well. So lots of opportunity to hear from all of you. Our agenda today is, like I said, this is really a panel discussion. We want to do a deep dive into some case studies with the Pivotal team here. But we're going to frame it around a couple bullets here. First, we'll do a quick reminder on what is product ops. I think our first webinar taught us that it still means a lot of things to a lot of people. So we'll kind of set the stage for what slice and flavor of it we are talking about today. And then we'll dig into some of the actual practices and processes that the Pivotal team dug into and kind of some of their lessons learned, looking back on it with hindsight. And then we'll jump into the live Q&A, try to leave ourselves the last 15, 20 minutes of our time for that. So another thing we like to do with the product stack, if you've joined before, you know this, this is your first time, is we like to sprinkle throughout the webinar some polls. This time around, we're going to do something a little more specific, where we're going to see how effective our panelists are in in persuading you or teaching you about product ops. So the ask here is, we'll make the same question at the beginning and end of this webinar, and then just use our time in the middle for lively conversation. So knowing what you currently know about product operations, do you believe it has a place in your organization? And so a second here, a poll screen should pop up. Feel free to click one of those answers. We've got currently about 250 attendees, so I'll wait until a good chunk of you have voted. We're almost there, so thank you everyone for quick responses, and this should show our results. Looks like we're at 36% say yes, absolutely, and another 31% says they're open to the idea, and then the remaining third of you aren't sure or no, definitely not. So our goal, the challenge I'm setting for the rest of this panel here, is to see if we can convince that 33%, specifically that 2%, that maybe they do have a place in the organization. Any surprises to the panel on these numbers here?
I think it's interesting to see the no of the 2%. If I had the opportunity, I'd love to dig in more. I don't believe that every organization will need to think about product operations, but I think there is some value in constantly sort of thinking about, like, where are you in your growth journey, and at what point should you be thinking about that more or not? And maybe the 2% here is saying, yep, we are at the size that we are, we don't plan on growing or scaling, and we don't need to worry about some of those interactions across the teams, and that'd be great. But otherwise, I would probably want to dig in a little bit more and understand some of that. But yeah, I'm excited for a good conversation, maybe change some minds here or reinforce some thinking. Amber, Ariel, any other thoughts?
I agree.
Okay, so before we get into then the panel discussion, I want to do a quick recap and very brief about what product ops is. And digging into our last webinar, we had John Cutler as the moderator in a great discussion with 4 panelists. And again, that's on our site if you want to watch it if you haven't seen it. But what we learned, the takeaway from that is that product ops is still this very broad discipline, and it seems to be a term that is popping up more frequently, in the sense that a lot of people have different definitions of what it means. And so even if it is a lot of things, some people still only think of it maybe as a very specific vertical slice. We're talking everything from scaling teams to operationalizing strategic alignment across the organization, to synthesizing and collecting data, to enabling SaaS delivery. So the physical delivery of your software is sometimes handled by the product ops team, similar to sales ops or other operations within the team. So it still has a lot of ground in which to play. And so that's where I think my biggest interest in the way that folks were answering the poll is to get a better sense, and hopefully people can do that through the questions that they ask, of what does product ops actually mean to them? And that might be where our conversation today can start to kind of reshape some of that thinking. With the team and panel we have today, we're going to be looking kind of much more specifically around scaling teams and kind of operationalizing those processes. And I believe that is, the journey that the 3 of you have been on in your time at Pivotal over the handful of years. And so I think for our conversation and case study, I really want to drill into that so that we are able to leave our audience with some practical takeaways that they can either apply to their team or rethink how it applies to them. So with that, why don't we jump right into the conversation? And I want to talk about, well, I guess I want to set the stage for everyone about the baseline of where and how Pivotal works today. And I think it's important that we start there so that everyone understands the journey in which you all took to get there, and that it is a unique journey. And I hope we get to some practical, actionable takeaways, but people are going to have to apply this to themselves. And so Ariel, if I can maybe turn it over to you, can you kind of elaborate a bit on how Pivotal works and functions today?
Yeah, absolutely. So Pivotal, you might be, oh, my lights just went out. I'll just keep going. Pivotal is a company that's been around for quite a long time, originally through Pivotal Labs, actually founded in 1989, so 30 years, a long time. And many of you on the call today may know us from many different sort of pieces of our organization. So just wanted to kind of ground you in where we're talking about today. So sort of at the highest level, Pivotal is really focused around this idea of kind of helping the world transform how different companies build, manage, maintain software, right? And really thinking about the best ways to do that. And we really have two parts of our organization. We have sort of professional services, so thinking about like Pivotal Labs if you've worked with them before, and then we also sell software. You may know Pivotal Tracker, you may have heard of Pivotal Cloud Foundry, but today we're really focused sort of on the software side and really focused on the specific organization called R&D or Pivotal Cloud Foundry. So that's where the three of us work. And when we think about sort of the way that we work and the things that really ground us in what we do every day, we really have these sort of core values that we think about. And this is really important, I think, for sort of how we work. Some of the things that really come to mind, feedback loops, continuous improvement, simplicity, thinking about sort of embracing change as a core value, underlie all the things we do and the way that we work every day. There's a couple other ones on the slide here. And what that then means is every day we also have the practices that we do. So we practice lean product development here, user-centered design, extreme programming, which is a flavor of Agile or XP, as you may have heard before. And kind of that founds the foundation of sort of everything we do. And something to really keep in mind as we're talking today is, we have these values and practices and principles, and then we also have our constraints. So the constraints that exist for Pivotal. We build software for large enterprises. We build software that's really sort of in the infrastructure space. So it can at times be kind of confusing. Who's the user? Who's the customer? What layers of abstraction are we working at? And we also deliver software on premise for many of our customers. So they have to go install something. So we don't always get those sort of fast feedback loops that you might have if you're building a web app or can kind of continuously be releasing something to your customer. So just keeping in mind today as we're talking, both the values, the practices, and then the constraints that exist for us. And I definitely encourage you to think about like what constraints exist for you and how would you modify these things based on your constraints.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that last nugget there that you shared is what's really important. When I think about this and the things that I try to get across when talking about this topic is in product management in general, it seems like a lot of our answers are always, well, it depends, right? It's kind of that double-edged sword. You never want to answer a question that way. But in this case, it really does, right? We're talking about processes. We're talking about how your team works and functions. And so while there are valuable, takeaways that we can learn about an Agile framework or about any kind of operations that a team does, how it applies to you is going to be very specific. And so you do want to take that step back, take everything that you've learned and really try to see how it applies to you specifically. So thank you for setting that stage.
Yeah, I wanted to, oh, sorry, Kevin. I also just wanted to amplify because of the slide and what Aria was talking about that. Notice that this over that, it doesn't mean that sometimes we won't have centralized decision making, or sometimes we'll need to do something, communication via some escalation. But it does mean that we value the stuff on the left more, and we will lean towards those, and that's what we're trying to aim for. And I want to make that clear because sometimes people are like, well, how do you just always make decisions decentralized? That can't ever just work that way, right? And so I want to call that out slightly as we continue the discussion to note that as well.
Great. Okay, so let's then kind of go back then a couple of years here, and maybe Amber, you can dig in a bit on this. Is that right now I think Pivotal Labs are around 80 teams.
That's correct.
But just a few years ago, you were much smaller. And so when you began this process, what was it, what were some of the early signs that you and the team noticed that said, we need to start operationalizing things in order to grow?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so kind of our current company that we work in was really sort of seeded in 2012 and launched in 2013. And back in 2012, we were essentially 3 teams co-located together in San Francisco, right? And as you mentioned, today we're more than 80 teams just in the R&D portion of the org alone that Ariel touched on, and we're distributed across 9 global offices. So we've definitely scaled quickly. I mentioned earlier, I've been working for about 4 years. So when I joined in early 2016, I think we were about 25 to 30 teams roughly in early 2016. And there were definitely a couple of scaling events that happened in that sort of 2016 timeframe that really made it obvious we needed to lean in harder into like operationalizing sort of our product management and product practices overall. The first was when I joined in early 2013 in that sort of 25 to 30 team range. We were still able to have like a global stand up where basically all the product managers would join and they would kind of say, hey, I'm working on this. I think this affects you in this way, etc. But that was already starting to break under scale because in a normal stand-up time, there was no longer enough time to actually allow everyone to meaningfully contribute. So that was already starting to break down. Additionally, you were experiencing the first real wave of growth outside of the San Francisco office. I was one of those team members that started in the Denver office as that was growing. And so for teams outside of San Francisco, there was this additional friction that we experienced of that growth, which was that we had traditionally had a very hallway conversation culture. We're all about pairing and co-location. And so that drove a hallway conversation culture. When you're not in the hallway, though, that's a big problem, and you're starting to miss tactical and strategic context as product managers, right? So that was a big point of friction we had there and surfaced that clearly we needed to lean into that problem. Over time, we were able to build a case that we were missing enough context that we got leadership support to start to lean in that meetings had to be remote friendly, that hallway conversations, should they occur, had to be recapped on Slack so that anyone remotely could do it. And first that felt a little bit prescriptive, but honestly, it just became part of our culture to where newer people coming in just think we're an extremely remote friendly culture. So that was kind of an obvious scale growth. Probably the other sign that happened in 2016 that we needed to lean into operationalizing more was the quality of our software actually started to decrease a little bit. So we were a very test-driven company, right? Test-driven development. But what was happening is as our company grew, as our products grew in scale and complexity, it started to become really hard to just test within one team or just tap those 2 or 3 teams on the shoulder that you knew your software might interact with. It started to become untenable for a single product manager or team to understand every way their software might interact with all of the other things. And so with that, we basically had to operationalize our product release and shipping processes and actually figure out how we might be able to like test at large scale. So I think those were kind of our 2 key, oh my God, we need to figure out this whole operation aspect. And I think one of the important takeaways kind of carrying from the last slide is if you're starting to feel these frictions or similar frictions in your organization, that it's important to recognize that there is definitely a time lag between people growth and putting those kind of practices in place. You can't completely prevent the friction. What's important is to pay attention and try to minimize that friction time as much as possible.
Great. So I want to hit on one thing you said earlier there is that a lot of the recognition kind of came from the team itself, and then you got buy-in from leadership. Is that the case kind of across the board? Was this kind of an organic, ground up recognition and do you think that is unique to how Pivotal works, or was that just because you're closest to the processes themselves?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that's unique. I think, the teams closest to the production of software are the ones who are going to feel the pain first. So we definitely felt it in the teams. In the case of like the hallway culture conversation, we actually probably experienced more friction than normal in the Pivotal culture, that the people in San Francisco didn't initially believe there was a real problem because they weren't experiencing it. And that's where most of the teams were, right? So it was very much a ground up and kind of presenting area like evidence where it was causing issues, and that sort of created that groundswell of leadership visibility. So I think that works similarly at most companies I've had the opportunity to work with.
Okay, and Tom, maybe you can dig in a little more on this too, this similar thread. So something that I've run into a lot in my career is that when you introduce any new type of change, even if there is a groundswell behind it, the reality is people fear change. And part of what we're talking about here is changing kind of accountability or changing responsibility and pulling things out of maybe what a PM may be doing and kind of giving it to a new role or a new department, depending on how the organization is set up. So was there any other type of resistance other than just getting leadership on board, but even within the teams themselves of, you know, we're really going to, like, because you kind of need buy-in from everyone to make this work. And so what was that journey like, and how did you navigate it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like we're generally lucky because we have a culture of learning and iterating at Pivotal. It means that we will have good collaboration and participation at all levels, so across from the teams and ICs all the way up through senior leadership. And I think some of what makes this change a little bit easier is maybe I'm going to focus on the slide for a second that we just showed, is that we do try to tend towards what's working at the team level and say, if this is successful at the team, can we take that practice and scale it to a group of teams or to the org, or even, you know, out further to our external partners? And that way it lessens that burden of being like, we're trying something totally new and something that's different, and something that may not work, or, you know, that we don't have any understanding about. It's something that we've seen work in practice. So going with that route tends to help a little bit. I also wanted to lean in a little bit on what you said about a lot of times when there is resistance, it is due to being very comfortable in the day-to-day, or feeling a little scared of the change. And usually I think that's because the change is unclear, or it doesn't really resonate. People want to know why. They really want to understand, like, why is this change happening? How is it going to help me? Or at least, how is it going to better help the outcome of our organization? And I think if they understand that, it makes it easier to try something new. And so we do find that we're spending a lot of time making sure everyone understands the why and is coming along that journey, and so that we can all learn and experiment together. So I think that's the second point I wanted to mention there. And then maybe two other really quick points is, we've learned that when you're implementing something bigger, we're talking about these experiments, right? We do want to test and iterate at a small scale to start. We don't want to just try to do some blanket big change across the whole org, especially when we're 80 teams now. So testing in a smaller representative group allows us to learn more, to iterate more, and we really get sort of two multiplying factors, right, that happen. One is that it helps us prove that it's helpful to the rest of the org. They can see the change, they can see what's happening, and that lowers the amount of anxiety that the other teams will have. And then two, it smooths out the rough edges because we get to improve as we go, and it helps with the adoption further along. We've never found that any top-down thou shalt type change will work, so the small iteration helps. And then maybe back to some of the values and principles here is, like, we're really just encouraging people to be curious and to learn. We want to have this like fun and playful attitude of like, let's just try this. Let's see what will happen. If it doesn't work, it's okay. Then we can go back, but we can try something different and see if it helps us. And then also, we don't have to be perfect, right? We're just trying to get better. Perfect will slow us down. So just try to get good.
I think, just to jump in really quick, I feel that, you know, a lot of times when we are trying to kind of explain the why to people, you know, not everybody in the organization can agree, right? Like we do our best to try and help people understand the why, but there's always going to be people who still don't understand it or don't agree with it. And I think in those moments, you know, we do ask people sometimes, like, take a leap of faith, let's try it. But what was really important to me is sort of thinking about, what is the feedback loop then that we have with those types of people who maybe do disagree, so that if it doesn't go well, if we try something and it doesn't work, they're not now stuck with a process that they don't believe in and don't understand. And that's really where that, like, experimentation and communicating what we tried and if we felt like it worked or didn't work comes back into play, to kind of make sure that even if we don't have that, like, everybody agrees, that people understand sort of why we're going one way or the other, and know that there's a point in time in which we can pivot from that and change if it doesn't work.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think having that sort of culture of experimentation, and also blameless, like, you know, if your idea sounded like a great idea, we're willing to try it, but it didn't really work out, you know, please keep suggesting ideas. So having that culture of experimentation, I think, makes it easier to get those people who do disagree to sort of take the leap, as Ariel mentioned, because we do tend to like, we're going to try this. Here's how we're experimenting on it. Here's how we're going to measure if it's making things better or not. And then we'll reassess and pivot if needed.
Great, awesome. So I want to jump in then to maybe some of the actual practices and operations you did operationalize here. And so talking about, sharing the why behind the things, what we're doing, I think as you look to scale your organization and teams, one of the biggest things folks tend to be concerned about is competing priorities. And where does my work or my priorities now fit? And some people get maybe afraid that their things are going to completely fall off. Others are like, great, my thing was never on the list, and now that we have more teams, I can, just give it to some. So I'm curious to learn a little bit more around that side of the scaling of teams. Of how did you deal with competing priorities?
Yeah, I can definitely talk to that. I almost want to talk about a practice that we use that worked really well for us, and then didn't work as well for us in more recent times as we continue to scale, because I think there's important things to learn for that. So around 2017, we introduced a sort of a process for us called the key priorities list, or KPL, because we have to acronymize everything in tech, right? So our KPL was basically a company-wide prioritized list of initiatives. At the time that we decided to try out this practice, we were suffering from sort of 3 points of friction at scale. And that was that we do have highly autonomous teams and empowered teams, but we had so many, leadership is losing track of what the teams are actually working on. The other friction point we're experiencing is the teams are having trouble reasoning around those top-down stories. There's always going to be customer fires and security concerns, et cetera. And they're having trouble reasoning about those top-down stories and how they should prioritize them against the features in their backlogs. Teams are also having trouble reasoning why other teams would tell them no or later, because that team was prioritizing something else above the thing they were asking for. And so they were having trouble reasoning around which initiatives were more important to leadership than other initiatives, right? So we introduced this key priorities list. It was literally like a fancy spreadsheet. It was like teams assigned, current status, forecast, etc. Everything had sort of a relative ranking with fires and those acute issues at the top, and then the sort of relative ranking of prioritized customer outcomes was determined by sort of office and company leadership.
And how granular were the items on that list? Are we down at like a story level, or is this kind of like thematic?
Thematic, not even like even above epic level, sort of like, because often outcomes can break down into several epics. So what is the unit of value we think we're delivering to the customer that has like meaningfully changed them in some way, right? So sort of at that level with maybe some key milestones and maybe a quick health check. So if you were on a top 10 team, leadership could look at that whole spreadsheet, even with that higher level granularity, and get a good idea for what the company was working on. But if you were in sort of a top 10 type of in that ranked list, you would meet with sort of the upper leadership weekly just to kind of talk about the project. That was great for collaboration with e-staff, etc. Worked really well for about a year, but then we realized that it actually stopped working as intended. It worked so well, and then all of a sudden it didn't. So maybe touch on a couple signs that we knew it wasn't working. So that was one. We had developed enough discipline around communicating around large efforts and keeping teams aware that it almost felt like those top 10 weekly meetings were no longer valuable. Like we would meet and we'd be like, we've already talked, so it no longer felt like a good use of time or e-staff's time. That was a good kind of first signal. But also, as we continued to scale, not everything could be on that list at any given time. And so what we found by, again, getting feedback from teams and retroing on process with teams is we found that by not being able to have everything on that large list, that it was actually acting as a disincentivizer to teams in some way. Oh, my stuff's not on the list. Does that mean it's not important, right? Should I not be suggesting new things, right? And so that was the point in time we realized like this worked really well for us for a year. We've scaled to where it no longer works, and having one list to rule them all is no longer the right approach for us. And so we instead have more recently shifted focus to just setting clear strategic outcomes that we want to prioritize, that we want to see happen, and then taking that cascading intent and actually shifting the when and the how down, decision-making down lower into the teams, and focusing that collaboration on how we intend to measure that we are marching towards those outcomes. So the intent now is no longer one this big spreadsheet, but rather a series of prioritized customer outcomes that cascade into teams so that we feel like the teams are still autonomous, but they're not directionless.
Awesome. I'm taking notes because it feels like I'm in a similar transition state right now. So I'm going to switch to that.
I wanted to highlight a little bit of what Amber just mentioned, because part of the thinking there to make that connection with that self-similarity slide is that our thinking from that was very much what works at the team level. Well, you have a prioritized backlog, right? So if we try that at the team level, how do we scale that to the company level? Let's try this key priorities list that is a backlog for the whole company that's bigger. And again, that's how that thinking came about and then helped us iterate into this cascading intent.
Awesome. And so now that you are more outcome focused, maybe even more so now with this cascading intent list instead. I think another concern then is when the decisions are being made at the team level then of implementing and how we achieve that outcome, you can maybe run into duplicative work, right? And so, Tom, maybe you can dig into that and talk about, as you scaled, how did you approach avoiding those types of issues?
Yeah, this is there's probably a lot to dig in here. Now I'll try to give some specifics, but may not want to go too deep because I can talk for a while.
Sure, I'll cut you off.
Yeah, cut me off if I go too far. I think the starting point here is going back to some of those principles, right? We do favor direct communication, intentional transparency, just the communication via collaboration. So looking at that, as we were scaling and from what we had mentioned from 3 teams to 20 to 30 to 80, we sort of have been scaling how we reduce this duplicative work, right? A lot of that starts at the team level. When we were smaller, we were able to do cross-team pairing. We were all co-located. We would say, great, you two are working on the same things. Let's just switch pairs. Let's talk about it. As we grew larger in that, we started not to be able to support that because we had different offices as well. What's something we can do to increase that transparency? We settled on something that internally we called a feature narrative and an inception. These are just terms that we have, which really I don't need to focus on, but the concept is we would draft up a document that basically told the story about what a team was trying to do. Why is this feature important? What's the customer outcome we're trying to achieve? How do we plan on getting there? What are some teams we think might be involved? And then again, when we were 30 or 40 teams, we could share it out to every team and say, all of you all read this document, comment in it. And for those who feel like you're doing something similar or have input, we'll invite you to this meeting that we called an inception. And you can join in and help us formulate this feature and we can figure out how to better work with you. So that's another example of us figuring out how to continue to work. That doesn't necessarily work at 80 teams as well. So maybe that's where we are now and trying to figure out what's next and talk about that a little bit later. But giving you some other examples too, we would do stand-ups, right? This is something that happens at the team level. And then we would do more stand-ups. We'd have office stand-ups and global stand-ups. And that worked when we were about 30 teams. And then at some point that doesn't work anymore. So how do we, again, share more information and help people feel connected and be able to help make decisions? Teams started to send out a thing called the drum beat. And for us, that's just, again, another fancy term, but it's a way for a team to do a bit of a team stand-up to say, here's what we're working on this week or these couple weeks or this month, the cadence they could decide. Here's what's next for us. Here are some learnings we have. Here are some experiments we're running. Here's some celebrations we had because we had some good wins or celebrating some failures even. But that would help us, again, keep the communication across teams a little more tenable. And then we wouldn't catch everything. There certainly sometimes might be duplicative work. And so we leaned in on retros, right? Retros is also part of the standard team practice. So we would start having cross-team retros or what we'd call incident retros, or there'd be a bad incident and we would try to figure out how can we do better next time. And having those conversations help reduce some of that duplicative effort as well.
I think just to jump in, as a product person, you're kind of constantly thinking about how do I reduce waste? I don't want to do the same thing twice. And you're really thinking, I want to stay lean. I want to make sure we're delivering the smallest possible thing. And definitely for me, having a lot of anxiety, like, oh my God, is that team over there doing the same thing I'm doing? And kind of realizing like, because we take these small iterative steps, it's not like you're going to go away for a year and both develop the same exact product and come back and realize like, oh my God, we did the same thing. Like that doesn't happen if you also take these iterative steps, communicate, collaborate, right? Like these values, again, coming back, are kind of safeguard you from really going too far down the wrong path. And if it's like being okay a little bit with a little bit of, the same effort going on, knowing that you'll catch it with some of these practices.
Awesome.
Yeah. Sorry. So then I wanted to come back to that, like, what's next thing, right? So I think earlier Amber was talking a little bit about how we moved into cascading intent, and what we've learned from that experiment now that it's been a year is that it's great that we set these company outcomes or company strategic outcomes that we're aiming for, and we say, okay, teams, how do you align towards that company outcome? But there's a big jump to go from the teams to these great company strategic outcomes. They can pick many different directions of how to maybe get to some of the outcomes. So we're realizing that we want to start experimenting with maybe a middle layer, not as a sort of, like another step in the communication, but as a way to create these nice continuous slivers of information that can radiate and help each of these teams or groups of teams to better think about the bigger company strategic outcome. So we're starting to explore what these programs might look like, and starting to look at looking at some growth boards or innovation accounting and things that Eric Ries talks about in a book that I would recommend called The Startup Way, and a few of his other books talk about this. But there's a lot there in terms of like, how do we start thinking about each group of programs as its own aiming towards their own outcomes. So that's sort of the next. I can't talk too much more about that because we're just starting that experiment, and for us, there's probably going to be a lot of learnings on the way, and maybe we can share more later. But that's where we are right now.
Great. So for time, I want to jump ahead a couple questions here. So we've mentioned key priority lists, cascading intent, feature narratives, drum beats, a lot of great and in some cases maybe innovative approaches to some standard practices that happen on the smaller scale, and how you want to scale those up as you grow. I'm wondering, other than just hitting some of those growth moments where you kind of mentioned you may be in one right now because it's starting to feel like it's not working as well, is there anything that's maybe more specific about when you should kill an idea that's not working and move on to something else?
Yeah, that's another really good question. I'll be honest, I think this is somewhere, I looked at Amber and Ariel to see if you all agree, but we could do better at Pivotal about this. And what I mean by that is, as you can hopefully see, we do a lot of experiments, but we certainly could do a little better at sort of measuring our experiments or being more explicit about what does success look like for this experiment. How do we know exactly when we're going to move forward and then decide what the next experiment is, or how do we know that this experiment has failed? And so we have been focusing more around those measurements, and you've heard us talk a little bit about that, but that's something that we are doing more so now. And if that helps us maybe kill, if we had more of that explicitness, I think that may help us kill ideas a little bit more quickly.
Great. Amber, Ariel, anything you'd add to that?
I think, I totally agree with that, sort of around the measurement pieces. I think, one of the other kind of aspects to this was, in a world where you are growing, right, and maybe adding more and more people to your teams, you don't always, you don't have the constraint of people or time potentially, and without those constraints, you may be able to kind of keep saying yes forever. So I think, as we think about sort of what is the shape of our organization, what is the right size, some of whether it's hiring constraints, whether it's growth constraints, whatever it is, I think can be a really healthy thing to kind of force some of the prioritization conversations and force a hard conversation about, is this worth investing in and continuing to invest in? So I think, I definitely recommend to people sort of like, be wary if you don't have constraints. If you don't have them, if you're part of a company that's like, we're going to keep growing forever, that's cool. But how can you kind of force some of those on top of yourself to think about what are the practices you'd put in place to consider if you should keep investing? I also kind of recommend to people flip it on its head and say, like, assume you won't keep doing the thing and sort of make the pitch to why you should keep doing it. I think definitely with some of the experiments we've run, assuming that we will only do it for a small period of time has allowed us to better defend why we should keep doing it in the future, which I think is super helpful with a product, with a process, whatever it is.
Yeah, and I would add on to Ariel's point about be wary of having no constraints. I think having been in such a mode of hypergrowth, it's easy, and we started to do the same thing to let some of those product practices, the diligence on them to fall behind a little bit, right? And so being very proactive, whether you are currently in a time of resource constraints, others, or you're in a period of rapid growth at your organization, is being very purposeful about some of your core product practices around like, what are the success metrics for this product, this project, this investment overall? What would it take for me to kill this? And like constantly measuring against it. Hopefully you convince yourself every time that this is awesome, it should continue, right? But like, what are those measures that would convince me to kill this? Or to recognize that the product fit is no longer the right thing for the changed marketplace. So what regular iterative processes is your team putting into place to reassess the market and reassess the market fit and measure against sort of this, like, we call it a kill analysis. And we certainly have started to be more diligent about that on our side as well. And it's really helped us during times of both constraint and non-constraint.
Awesome. That's great. So Ariel, you hit on a topic that I'm going to come back to in Q&A if we have enough time, but you talking about hiring, and when we're talking about changing and adding new processes to how teams work, I think the other half of this puzzle is there changing to the processes around how we actually scale that team and hire them. So I think that's a really interesting topic. For sake of time, I'm going to push that into the end, but keep that thought in your head if we're able to come back to it. We've been getting a lot of awesome questions that the audience has been submitting, so I want to get to those as soon as we can. So maybe before we jump into that, just in hindsight or with hindsight, is there anything that you wish you had known before you got started on this journey? Maybe as practical of a bit of advice that you can leave our team with or our audience with, hoping that we've converted some of those 33% into I think we need to operationalize some of the things on the product side of the house. What are the pitfalls we should let them look out for?
I would definitely warn, as you consider operationalizing and what your processes look like, et cetera. I would definitely warn against like overly complicated frameworks, right? Prioritization frameworks. There's a lot of really cool prioritization frameworks out there. But definitely caution you against overcomplicated. Emphasize easy to understand, right? One of our experiments that didn't work as well was sort of a mathematical weighting to sort of our certain set of top customers that would basically add a multiplying factor to like their feature requests and needs, etc. It was a really great framework on paper, but it was so kind of mathematically complicated that people struggled to understand it, and that made it therefore not useful. So some of the signals it wasn't working, our new PMs were struggling to understand it. PMs were chasing those customers in order to get idea of multiplier instead of necessarily sampling our full customer distribution. And how we defined and favored sort of those top customer quests during this experiment meant we were sometimes prioritizing features that weren't broadly applicable to our larger customer base, right? And so that was one I'd caution you for chasing the coolest framework. Focus most on easy to understand and seems to make sense for your business.
Tom or Ariel, any quick bits of advice?
Yeah, my quick advice is similar to what I said earlier about that experiments, or make sure you have measurements around experiments, but maybe to be more broad about that, really it's like, how can you help make the experiments more visible across your company? Can we create more structures around experiments and really help amplify the learnings, which might include celebrations on failures, right? So I think really amplifying that, I think, and making experiments more visible is something that I would take it with hindsight.
Awesome. Ariel?
I think mine is really focused around, the idea of embracing change. I think a lot of people talk about embracing change from a product perspective, but having that be sort of a core value of both the product teams and of your organization makes it so that when you do want to try these experiments or adapt, like adapting is the norm. And so, when you were asking about were people resistant to the change? It's like if change and kind of experimentation is part of everything you do, the minute you kind of feel these pains, you can keep trying things and iterating and trying something new all the time, which I think is really important, just not getting stuck in things. So, I definitely embracing change both at a product level and at an organization level we did it, but I wish we had done more.
Awesome. Okay, and then this is another a quick little takeaway that you all wanted to leave with the audience. Does someone want to briefly walk through what we're looking at?
Yeah, just before the questions, I think this is a great slide to wrap up a little bit. I think we've talked about each of these things. And so again, it's this idea of like taking some patterns that you see working and then trying to scale it up. And so this gives you that list. And really just, it's a chance to remind you to think about the values here. Ours are be kind, do what works, do the right thing. And I think you've seen us talk through that in some form of fashion. And again, focus on the principles, focus on the constraints, and then again, those feedback loops, right? How do you get those feedback loops and keep learning from that? So that's really what we wanted to try to leave with and thinking about scaling and how to make it less painful and have people embrace the change.
Awesome. All right, well, we're going to get into Q&A here in a second, but as promised, we're going to launch this poll real quick. And so knowing what you now know, do you believe product operations has a place in your organization? Fingers crossed that we did our jobs, folks. Almost all votes are in. I'm going to share, and I think we made a difference. Let's see if it's up there. We now have 54% are yes, absolutely. That was up from 36. I'm open to the idea. 29 stayed right around where we were at in the beginning. But I'd love to see that big change there. The I'm not sure yet, and the no's definitely. We made some progress there. So very cool. Now let's actually dig into some Q&A, and maybe we can get that last couple percent there. So we talked about a lot of different things here. The one thing that we didn't cover, but this is a great question to think about. I'm going to send it to Amber, to you first. Is how was the feature time to market affected by growth and scaling, right? And so if you have and are spending so much time internally trying to operationalize and improve your team, how is that having an effect on what you're actually delivering to customers?
Yeah, I mean, if you're really focusing on it, there may be sort of an initial sacrifice of, time spent as a company, but hopefully that time is recouped by your improved processes. So, this is a sort of a case study, so I'll tell you from firsthand experience at Pivotal. As we leaned harder into these practices, we didn't necessarily see the feature time to market slip from within team or small team. Where we did start to see some risk around feature time to market slipping is in those larger efforts where several teams cross organization had to contribute together. So through some of this scale, PMs were struggling with, how do I keep context on who to talk to? I worked, new teams are forming, the PMs I built relationship capital with now manage other teams. How do I successfully argue another team should prioritize this dependent work, et cetera? Traditionally, an organization would sort of lean into maybe a technical program manager, sort of coordinating efforts across teams. We actually found that one person ownership model started breaking down and wasn't necessarily improving this time to market feature slip we were seeing in those cross collaborative efforts. This is where we believe that our more current practice of sort of a current outcome oriented program structure with strong product design and engineering leadership in these like larger areas is and having the decision makers in those larger areas is what's allowing us to overcome those challenges and sort of return to our normal speed to market. So yeah, we did definitely see an initial bump, but that was sort of how we were able to work through it.
Awesome. Cool. Awesome. Another question here. This one's from Caitlin. Tom, I'm going to throw it at you. As it's talking about the KPLs. So when working through KPLs, what teammate owned this, right? Is there is that a PM or a PO responsibility, or does it kind of get shared across the organization?
Yeah, I don't want to go maybe too detailed into this, but try to get a sense to answer the question. We have a role called an anchor role, which is someone that's on the team that tends to be someone who's looking a little bit more at the health of the engineering teams and working with them. We tend to have the PM and the anchor attend some of these KPL check-ins at the time, and they would be the ones helping work through how we're progressing there. If it was a larger cross-team initiative, sometimes we would have a technical program manager helping out there. But yeah, I think that is, yeah, so I think we do expect that the teams in some way would own this. And being that the product manager is thinking about the product and those outcomes and thinking about how we might get through some of that, having this anchor in there would help facilitate those conversations.
Awesome. Cool. Another question here, Ariel, we'll send this one to you. This is from Michael. Can you speak about how you handle any of the challenges regarding stakeholders needing to be part of a sprint review at such a large scale, right? Michael's saying that they have stakeholders who are interested in all of their product teams, so it's challenging to get that participation and feedback to them in an appropriate way.
Absolutely. I think, we think a lot about, we actually, in some cases, don't even call them stakeholders at Pivotal, which maybe is a little bit different than many of you watching today. But thinking about sort of how can we set that strategy sort of at the higher level, and that's sort of like the company saying at a leadership level, this is the direction that we're going, and letting the team sort of decide where exactly they're going to go, or how exactly they're going to get to where we're trying to get to as a company. And so we don't really have a lot of these like stakeholders at the sort of executive level in a iteration or sprint planning meeting. We don't necessarily having them watching every single story that's coming out, right? Like they're really looking to the team to communicate upwards the things that are important. They're not, coming into, their meetings in that way. But that's to say, like, they're not completely free to do whatever they want, right? They still need to tell the product narrative, the story of what they're working on. And they do have check-ins with certain types of stakeholders over time, really to kind of gather feedback. I've never been sort of in a meeting where someone's like, stop what you're doing exactly in your backlog right now and do something different. But it's, a conversation, and it's sort of, if you are going to make those big leaps, I was talking about these like small iterative steps. If you are going to make these big leaps or changes in the direction of your team, you're really responsible kind of for getting that group together, whether that's a stakeholder or some other leadership person, and talking through that. And really, as a team, you're explaining the why. You're really responsible for explaining the why behind the decisions you're making, and the stakeholders of your team really need to sort of respect that. I think, again, though, that goes back to our culture. And really a shift in culture. I know that it's easier said than done at a lot of companies where you do have interested stakeholders, but I do think it goes back to a lot to like the trust in the teams, and to obviously bring it back to hiring, like having people that are really awesome people to be able to say like we can trust all these people to do a great job, and to communicate upwards like we need it.
I wanted to tack on just a little bit here because I think it's interesting to see the statement here. I think it was those that are our stakeholders are interested in all of our product teams. So it's challenging to get the participation and feedback from them. I wonder what's the interest there? Like I want to ask, why are they so interested? Like maybe they're missing a signal, and then there's another way for them to get that versus having to feel like they need to be at all of these. So again, this is the asking why and trying to understand why. And then the second part of this is, so if they're not participating in the right way, do they understand what this meeting is and what their role is and how to best engage? And maybe we need to dig into that conversation and saying, we need more participation from you. We're looking for feedback. This is the meeting where we expect that, and then reset that expectation with the whole meeting attendees. So again, maybe that gives you a flavor about us, how we go about asking the why and how we would dig into some of these. But I thought that was very interesting to point to. On top of everything that Ariel said as well, that's where I would see, I would want to dig into a little bit here.
Yep, that's a good point. Amber, I'm gonna combine two questions for you here, as I think they're related, but everyone else can feel free to jump in as well. There are so many positions that could be added to a team, and when we're talking about product operations, that can be business analysts, data analysts, SaaS operations, all that stuff. Caitlin is curious how your teams were currently or stacked throughout this process. And then I'm going to tack on a question from Vina here is, what is the role of the product manager as some of these operations start to scale? Do their responsibilities change?
Yeah, sure. So sort of in our current structure now, so I'm like a product lead of an area. So I'm part of a balanced team that's over several teams, all kind of driving towards a certain set of outcomes. So I have a counterpart that's an engineering lead, a design lead, et cetera. To kind of come down into like our individual team levels, we do sort of have a core set of roles that we make sure is on every team. And that is generally the classic kind of two pizza agile model, right? You should be able to feed your team with 2 pizzas. So a product manager, a designer, and the engineers. And they're basically working in a balanced team construct. Product, is this valuable to the business and is this viable? Design is like, is this thing we're building desirable, right, and wanted by our customers? And engineers like, is this thing feasible to build, to keep up, etc. So that's our classic balance team. Then depending on sort of what that team is setting out to accomplish, the scope of their roadmap, etc., we may supplement them with additional team members, either as full-time or just a sort of like a process of those team members regularly checking in and supporting that team. So those people can look like docs, they can look like field and marketing if it's an innovative new product and we want that influence in there early. It can look like our field teams that sit with customers, engineering solutions, if it's a more mature product that we want to get a really fast feedback loop. That can look like support, and it can look like our products team, our kind of classic product ops team, where we've confused the term a little bit, but that is a combination of both supported team practices and also sort of how to go to market type practices at Pivotal. And so we tend to supplement that core team with those different roles depending on what outcomes we're trying to influence. The role of sort of product ops and product managers, in general, we try to infuse product ops practices into the product management practice as much as we can, since we do have one on every team, as well as sort of that program structure of happening at that program level as well. Where we do have product ops team members like that are dedicated to that, they tend to support a few teams at once right now. And I find like where they're able to complement us and complement the product manager is the product manager, as many of you on the call will recognize, are very heads down people. It can be hard to come up and breathe for air. You're just juggling so many things, trying to think strategically and tactically at the same time, right? It's a fine balance. And so some of the things that drive your decision making and can be more time consuming. Things like pulling your product metrics, looking for adoption, decline or growth, the stickiness of your product, etc. This is where product ops has been really helpful for us, of helping support from like product metrics tracking. They've also helped support like making sure, we said we're a high experiment culture. Tom said we're always trying to improve on that. So one of the things that they can also support product teams on is that kind of experiment validity and tracking. So like, it's great you're experimenting. Are you learning? Are you changing the product from that, right? So like, are the experiments comparable across teams? Are they leading towards valid and actionable outcomes? So that's another where product ops has sort of helped complement the classic product management role.
Great, okay. We got time for one last question. I'm gonna make it one that everyone gets to answer, and I will answer it myself since I'm gonna put everyone in that position. We've got a couple minutes left here. Can we all provide our own definition of product operations? I'll start. I think, to me, I think of product operations as adding the science to the art of product. I think building product, researching, everything that goes hand in hand with shipping product, there's a lot of art to it, and there's different ways and methods and everything about it. Product operations is trying to tease out anything about that process that can be systematized and made more, more consistent or reliable, so that you can spend more time on that strategic side of things. So that's how I think of it, as a broad definition. Obviously, then many things can slice into it, but that's how I think of it.
Yeah, that was a great way. I think you probably are going to end up putting it best by calling it an art. Yeah. The consistency helps with efficiency, and so the product ops is really, like you said, a science and an art to help support that team efficiency and help teams streamline their product development.
I think I'll just throw in yet another word, but sustainability flexibility as well, right? Like I wrote a lot of notes while we were talking about, like, not only can you do this once, not only can you do it many times, but you can, we say a lot like go fast forever, right? You can do that in a sustained way. So, if one person leaves the company, you're not in a really bad place. If one process, you need to iterate on it, you're not in a bad place. It's sort of the system that you build to kind of have that sustainable model, whether it's product or people, whatever that is.
Yeah, I might just add, I love this last question because we commonly refer to this at Pivotal, and probably maybe others elsewhere, as the taco problem, where there's this concept of, you say taco, do you mean hard taco or soft shell taco? And I think that this could mean a few different things, but Kevin, I really liked your definition towards that. One additional point I wanted to add, because you all might enjoy reading different things, is a book that I look to in terms of scaling and looking at how we can better operationalize things is a book called Accelerate. The subtitle of this is The Science of Lean Software and DevOps, Building and Scaling High-Performing Technology Organizations. Again, that book is Accelerate, and it's by a Dr. Nicole Forsgren. I think I'm saying that correctly, but you can look that up, and it's a great read.
Awesome. Great. Okay. And with that, if you can believe it, it's already been an hour. I think I could go on about this topic with all of you for another hour, but we'll respect everyone's time. And now that Tom started talking about tacos, it is my lunch break. So I'm going to go grab some of those. I want to thank everyone who joined us for taking the time out of your day. And specifically, I want to thank Tom, Amber, and Ariel. This has been a great conversation. Really excited to have you all on here and share kind of some of the personal experiences that you all went through. So thanks again for joining. As a reminder, please hop over to theproductstack.com. We will share out video for this, but you can join our Slack and we can continue the conversation that way. And then we'll be wrapping up our series on product operations with another webinar in November about how you can, some more of the tacticals around implementing product ops. So with that, I will say thank you to everyone and we'll talk soon. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.